With this lecture, we begin step 2 in the process of creating this narrative essay. So far, what you've done basically is gather information. Okay, I had you interview somebody, take a bunch of notes, and then stop there. Well, today we're going to take that information and we're going to learn how to organize it. This is a really important tool to have, especially if you ever have one of those teachers that likes to have in-class essays. I don't, but a lot of teachers do. And it really does help out if you have a means of organizing your thoughts before you sit down and just start writing that essay. That gets you into the danger of meandering into other territory, okay? When your mind starts to wander and your essay starts to wander and you start talking about things that have nothing to do with your main idea, that's because you didn't organize those ideas beforehand. So this is one method I'm going to show you for organizing those ideas. It's a mapping strategy, basically. Before I tell you about that, though, I want to show you some pictures. So this is a technique known as mind mapping. And there's a reason why it's called mind mapping. We're going to talk about that in a minute. First, I want to show you some pictures and see if you can see the commonality between these pictures. There's something they all have in common. This is a type of sea anemone. It lives in the ocean. Notice its structure. Notice how this thing is put together. That is a dried up coral, also found in the ocean. Notice the structure of it. Already, can you see something in common between these two guys? Look at that. Look how they're shaped. These are the roots of a giant tree. The top of a giant tree. Isn't it interesting how the structure is the same on the top and the bottom? Are you noticing what they have in common? These are the veins in a leaf. This is your circulatory system. Right there in the middle is your heart, and then the heart branches out with the arteries, very thick, and then you get a series of vessels. Blood vessels, and they get tinier and tinier and tinier until they're called capillaries, which are the tiniest vessels in your body. So do you see that structure? A big structure in the middle starts it off. Then there's a large structure that branches off of it, and then that structure branches off, and then it just keeps getting tinier and tinier until you get to those tiniest little capillaries. That structure is what we've been looking at in all these pictures. It's what they all have in common with each other. Do you know what that is? This is a neuron. It's a brain cell. The actual cell is this little white dot right there. But look at the structure. These little guys are called dendrites. And dendrites are how your brain cells speak to each other and work with each other. Here's an interesting thing about dendrites, by the way. Did you know you can grow new ones? You can actively cause your brain to grow new dendrites. And when you get smarter, or when you learn something or understand something, you're actually growing more of these little dendrites. It was recently discovered that you actually can grow new neurons, but for the most part, when you're improving the health of your brain, it's dendrites that you're growing. Your brain cells connect to each other through these little tiny thread-like structures. And the more of them you have, basically, the better your brain is working. If you challenge your brain to do something unusual, like learn a new language or solve a puzzle, or even something as simple as using your left hand to brush your teeth instead of your right hand, you're actually forcing your brain to look at something in a different way and to work differently. And in doing so, it's producing new dendrites. You actually can work out your brain just like it's a muscle in your body. It's pretty neat. Now, there's an argument as to how we think of ideas and how we organize our thoughts and how we learn new things. And this structure that we've been looking at, this structure between all these different things, kind of fits into that. Here's how. So there are different theories about thinking and learning and about how we go about that. One theory is a linear theory, and it states that people think in a very linear way. That a linear means line, by the way, right? A line, and that our thinking happens in a line going across, basically. Here's what I mean by that. Let's say you learn something new. I learned point A just now, and that leads you to learn something else, B. And once I understand B, I can move on and learn the next step and learn the next step. So it's linear. It goes in a line, A, B, C, D, right? While back, this new theory came about that was more clustered and web-like. It wasn't a straight line. It was a bunch of lines, and these lines intersected with each other. And it kind of plays off the idea and the theory of previous knowledge. We're going to talk about that possibly next week. Again, we're going to go into a lot more detail about what this previous knowledge is and what it has to do with active reading and active learning. But for now, think of it this way. Same model, basically, but it changes up based on your previous knowledge. So let's say I just was told A. Okay, I just learned this in a textbook. But A reminds me of something that I learned when I was in high school. So instead of going forward in the book, it's actually taking me back and reinforcing something that I learned before. And that thing that I learned before is reminding me of something else that happened in that time when I was learning that thing. And because of that new understanding, I kind of skipped ahead to C. I went from A to C based on my previous learning. So all of this other stuff is coming into play. It's not just a line of learning. I learned this and I learned this and I learned this. Because it's not that simple. It's a cluster of ideas. And these cluster of ideas can do all kinds of interesting things. You end up basically with sort of a web of ideas. Not a line, but a web. And all these different pieces reinforce each other. And that takes us back to this neuron. There is a theory that if nature is hardwired with this pattern of branching off. In fact, even our brain structure is hardwired in the same manner. Well, maybe our thoughts work the same way. So maybe a linear approach to learning isn't the most natural way for our brains to receive information. And that led to a new mapping technique. And that leads us into mind mapping. Notice the structure of it. Notice how this thing is put together and how similar it is to those shapes I was showing you that came directly from nature. I mean, if you think of this as a circulatory system, you've got the heart in the middle, pumping the blood, and shooting off from that, there's the major artery, and that artery becomes smaller and smaller and smaller until you get to those capillaries. It just continues to branch off, branch off, branch off, just like your circulatory system, that same pattern. And for that reason, mind mapping was created. Now, this map has a bunch of different uses. It's a great way to collect your thoughts. It's a great way to remember things. It's a great way to create a list of things you need to do. It can also take the place of a formal outline. If you ever had a teacher who used outlining for your writing classes, one of these, this is the traditional way of organizing your thoughts, basically. And there is a very strong logic to this type of map. This is a map of ideas, basically. But it doesn't work for everybody. I find a lot of students I've had in the past really didn't take to outlining. It just didn't make sense to them. So I started using this method instead because it's got a different set of rules. I wonder if you can figure out what those rules are just by looking at this. How is this thing physically different than that outline I showed you? Well, for one thing, it starts in the middle. This guy starts at the top and works its way down, right? But not this one. It starts in the middle and it branches out. It's a very open plan, you could say, for a map. Your main idea goes in the middle, and then you divide that main idea into smaller parts, which is basically what you're doing with an essay, right? Whatever your argument is, if your argument is that you don't like going to the movies, and these are the reasons why, then you're going to take that main argument, I don't like going to the movies, and you're going to dissect it and turn it into a bunch of smaller arguments. These are the individual reasons why I don't like going to the movies. And that's what those arteries are doing. But it doesn't just stop at the artery, right? You go beyond that and you start giving examples and evidence and information. So that would be what these smaller vessels are going to be. The argument behind mind mapping is that the information is more readily available. And pictures have something to do with that. A picture, you know that old term, that old phrase, a picture says 1,000 words? Well, it really is true. One picture can tell an entire story, whereas a few words, not necessarily. And so if you can say something with a picture, or if you can use a picture in tandem with a word or two to tell a bigger story, then by all means put that picture in there. It holds information and it helps you to remember things. So pictures are good. Color is also important. Color can be used for different reasons in a mind map. In this case, each artery got its own color, right? We're going to use it a little bit differently for when we use it in as a substitute for formal outlining. We're going to use color in a slightly different way to show those different levels of information. Finally, notice how few words there are. You don't see any sentences in here, do you? In fact, it looks like everything in here almost is just a series of individual words. And so you don't want to have to read entire sentences or paragraphs. If you're going to do that, you might as well just read the book again. But with this, you've just got key words that bring to mind more complex ideas behind them. So those are pretty much the rules of creating a mind map. As we're organizing our thoughts for this essay and planning out how we're going to tell the story, we're not going to use outlining this time. We're going to use mind mapping instead. For those of you that are comfortable with formal outlines, that's great, but I want you to try this technique. You don't have to love it. You know, if you don't want to use it on future assignments, that's totally okay. But this one time, this is actually going to be a mandatory piece of this essay. You're going to hand in this mind map with the essay for additional points, okay? So make sure you do this. I want you to be open to the experimentation. At least try the technique. Again, you don't have to love it, but I want you to have the experience of going through with it. So this is how this is going to work, okay? The mind map is going to take the place of an outline, but it's going to have all the same information. Basically, you're taking all the info that came from your sheet of notes from when you interviewed this person, and you're going to turn those into a mind map. Here's how that works. You're going to start out with your center, and this is going to be your main idea. This is going to be the thing that holds the entire essay together. Really, really important. Now, I don't want you to just write main idea in there. I want you to give me the parts of that main idea. Here's how that's going to work, okay? Before we get into the actual mapping, we got to set it up. And to do that, I want you to answer 3 different questions. Who, what, and why. Now, here's what I mean by that. Pretty simple. I want you to actually answer these 3 questions and put them in the center of your mind map. These are going to become your thesis statement later on when we start talking about thesis statements. We're not there yet either. It's just a collection of information. Who did this thing happen to? What is the thing that happened? And why is not why did it happen? I can figure out why it happened. It's why is it significant? Remember how I really harped on that idea of significance in the person's story? And if there was no significance, there was nothing to hold the story together. That's why I need you to ask that question. So if you go back to this, as you're creating this and looking at your notes and you realize you don't know what the significance is, that means that person didn't tell you. You need to find them again and ask them. Call them on the phone and say, well, why was this story significant? In other words, what's the lesson that you learned having gone through this thing? If you just ask them, what's the lesson you learned? That'll answer the question about significance. So, who, what, why? I'm going to make one up, okay? Who is my friend Jerry? I interviewed my friend Jerry. What happened to him? Jerry had an appendicitis, okay? Most important, why is it significant? Well, in Jerry's case, it's significant because he learned a lesson about listening to his body and taking care of his health. That's significant. It changed his life, right? After this appendicitis happened, he learned to take care of himself. He learned to listen to the signs that his body was giving him. He learned to be more careful about how he treated his own body. That's a lesson learned. So I would actually put those right in the middle here, okay? I'm going to write Jerry, appendicitis, learn to take care of his own health, okay? That's all you got to do for that. Once we've got that, we can kind of forget about it for a while. We're going to revisit the center part later on when we actually start writing the introduction. Again, that's down the road. But for now, just have this safely tucked away inside this map. Now here's where the actual story comes into play, okay? Remember those arteries. That's the next level of information. That's the second level of information. So I'm going to use a different color to show that we're onto a different area now. And in fact, I'm going to be really specific about it. I want you to have 3 arteries. Here's why. Every story should have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Because we have 3 arteries, we're going to have 3 body paragraphs. The body paragraphs are where you're going to tell the actual story. Not the introduction and not the conclusion. Those are different paragraphs that have a different job in the essay. But the body paragraphs, all those paragraphs in the middle, are you actually telling this person's story. The good news is, once you've collected the story, the essay is half done. It's half written because you've already got the person's story, right? All you're doing is just organizing the ideas that are inside of it. So, beginning, middle, and end, it's going to be 3 body paragraphs. Now, look at that sheet of notes that you've taken, all those bullet points. This happened, and this happened, and this happened. That's what we're going to start writing here when we get to those smaller blood vessels, right? So, just fill your map up with a bunch of these guys. They're just shooting off and telling different steps or occurrences or details of the story. Now, something to keep in mind here. Beginning, middle, and end. These are specific parts of the story. And a lot of you are going to be very tempted to start the beginning of your story with the thing that happened. I'm writing about Jerry's appendicitis. But I don't want to start my story, Jerry had an appendicitis, because I want to lead up to it. That's kind of giving away the entire story right up at the front. Once I hear that, why do I even want to keep reading? Right? You want to keep your reader interested and you want to work them into the story. You want to gradually take them through the steps of this major thing happening. Usually, the thing that happened would be in the middle of the story because it's like the climax of the story. You know, you start at the beginning, you climb up, you get to the climax of the story, which is this big thing that happened, and then you tell us the aftermath of the story. So it's kind of like a slope, isn't it? So, the beginning of a story is not the thing that happened. It's what happened before that thing happened. I want to tell my story leading up to Jerry's appendicitis. I'm not even going to mention appendicitis yet, right? So, the beginning of the story, Jerry woke up that morning feeling a little bit woozy. Okay, can you see how I'm leading into this thing happening in the middle of the story? He could smell downstairs that his mom was cooking bacon, and it made him feel sick. Normally, he loved the smell of bacon. He thought he had a cold maybe, or a mild flu. He decided to go to school anyway. He didn't really feel like it, but it was picture day, and it was an important day, and he didn't want to miss it, blah, 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 blah. All I'm doing is telling the steps of my story leading up to the thing happening, okay? Now, middle of the story. This is going to be the next body paragraph. The thing happened. Jerry was sitting in class at a desk, and his stomach started to feel really, really bad, and he felt lightheaded, and he passed out. He passed out in class. I'm telling the story right now. These are all the things happening. This happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. All these different steps, because now this thing is happening in his belly. Something just exploded, and he's feeling like crap, right? That's the thing happening. The aftermath. After his appendix burst, what happened? He woke up, he came to, he regained consciousness in an ambulance. He was being taken to the hospital. When he got there, he had emergency surgery. this happened and this happened. When he woke up in bed, there was a nurse standing by him, and he said, Jerry, you're very lucky. You know, a lot of people die when their appendix burst. You were this close to passing away, and blah, 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 blah. And he learned a very valuable lesson, blah, 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 blah. That's the end of the story. Can you see how all these different pieces fit together in one continuous story? But I'm breaking it up into 3 pieces, okay? This happened before the thing, this is when the thing happened, and this is what happened after that thing happened. That's how I want you to organize your map. By the way, I'm now just suddenly realizing I was using color wrong on the 3rd detail. I really should have been using something different, like this, because this is a 3rd level of information, isn't it? All of these details, these smaller bits of information, they all have the same job, so I'm making them all orange. So, red is my main idea. My body paragraphs, I made green. And the actual story inside the body paragraphs, I made orange. Essentially, that's what I want your map to look like. Doesn't have to look just like mine. You can put whatever pictures you want. Tell it any way you want to. Make sure you have a complete story in here. Some of you are going to cheat me out of some really good information, and I'm going to send it back to you and say, I'd like some more, okay? Don't cheat me out of the story. Everything you have on your page, all the notes you took, and remember, I wanted you to take a page full of notes. I want to see all of that stuff in little bubbles on this map here, okay? Now, when you're done with the map, don't give it to me yet. I am going to take it. You are going to send this to me, and I am going to give you points for doing it because I want to encourage you to do it. But don't send it to me yet. Just hold on to it because you need it with you for the next step. Okay, the next step is going to be we're going to actually start writing this thing. We're going to take all this information and start thinking about paragraph formation. So don't give it to me yet, but just do it. I'm giving this to you on today, Thursday. So that means you've got an entire weekend to get this interview if you haven't done it yet. I'm sure a lot of you haven't gotten to it yet. Take the weekend to get an interview, talk to somebody, take a page of notes. Don't skip the page of notes. Turn that page of notes into a map that looks something like this, and then hold on to it. Okay, on Monday, we're going to start writing this thing. So be prepared. Have this map ready to go. This is an important step. You need this information, and you need to organize this information before you start writing your paragraphs. So work on the map over the weekend, okay, and then on Monday, I'll give you the next step in the process.